Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Ilona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. I'm delighted to be joined now by Serhii Plokhy, who is a professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard University and a Baillie Gifford Prize-winning author. He's written a number of brilliant books about Ukraine and about nuclear power, nuclear energy, including The Gates of Europe, The Russo-Ukrainian War and Atoms and Ashes. His book, Chernobyl, History of a Tragedy, was one inspiration for the HBO series Chernobyl about the 1986 disaster. But this morning we're talking about his most recent book, Chernobyl Roulette, which is out in the UK on the 3rd of September and tells the story of what happened at Chernobyl in the early months of the full-scale war, when the plant, the exclusion zone and the towns of the area were occupied by invading Russian soldiers for 35 days. Serhii, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So you've written about Chernobyl extensively in the past. This is familiar subject matter in a way. But when did you realise that you were going to return to Chernobyl again as a subject and that there was a new story to tell?
It was relatively late in the entire process of me thinking about the war, writing about the war. When the all-out war started, the invasion started on February 24th, 2022, I was in Vienna researching another book on Chernobyl. Vienna is the place where the International Atomic Energy Agency is located. They have wonderful archives. So I was working in that archive, and then the war started. And suddenly the topic that I worked on seemed to me so removed from any reality, any concerns that I had at that time, people in Ukraine, people in the world had. So I left the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency, didn't come back because Chernobyl seemed to be so removed, that the tragedy of the past, which was really overshadowed by the tragic developments of that day and moment. And it was only 1 year later that somehow I came back to the topic of Chernobyl, and I realized that the day on which I left the headquarters of IAEA in Vienna, they got involved in the war in the way that I didn't know about that, because on that day the Russian forces took over Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And I thought that, well, I really want to know. All my books start with my own personal interest in the story. I really want to know what happened there. And the only concern that I had, whether I would have enough sources. And I got quite lucky. The book is very much based on the basic work done by others, which are journalists. There is a project called Reckoning Project in Ukraine, where the journalists went into the recently deoccupied, liberated areas of Ukraine, like Chernobyl, were interviewing people there. And I was privileged they allowed me to use those materials. And once my interest was matched by the availability of the sources, I decided, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And then, surprisingly, for me it was a surprise. I suddenly realized that, well, I'm actually well qualified to write that book. I was writing on Chernobyl before. I have written a book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. It's a perfect match. But I was getting to this realization in a somewhat strange way, with a lot of detours, a different sort of thinking. Not that, okay, I'm qualified to do that, let me do that. It came really out of the interest, and then making sure that there was, for me as a historian, there was enough sources to work with.
And I mean, in the book, you take us immediately back to those first days of the war, and when Russian troops entered Ukraine via Belarus and were making kind of a beeline for Kyiv, but in doing so passing through Chernobyl, which is obviously, a key site and not just kind of like a road to drive down, but a very sort of important and become a very sort of important strategic place as well. But that all happened very quickly at the beginning of the war. So when you came to write the book, you draw on the stories of one man who actually had a camera set up in the Chernobyl area, and that he saw in live time what was happening. I mean, can you tell us a bit about what he saw and what the Ukrainians in Chernobyl, or who had an interest in Chernobyl, saw in those first days?
Yeah, the person we are talking about, his name is Yaroslav Yemelyanko. He is a really, really remarkable personality, someone who built from scratch the largest tour operator in the zone, Chernobyl tour, and those of our listeners who maybe went to Chernobyl before pandemic, before the start of the war, probably used services of Chernobyl tour. He really was getting ready in early 2022 to start a new tourist season, because before that there was pandemic. So his business was almost killed by that. So finally there were these expectations, and in January he announced on the Facebook that he was recruiting new guides for Chernobyl tour, bringing back those that worked for him before. And he was very reluctant really to accept that, with all this situation, with the war, what was viewed at that time as a war scare, in reality the war was coming. He was maybe one of the last to accept that, the tourist season is not taking place. There will be a lot of people in the zone, but they will not come using the services of his company and his agency. And once the war started, he realized, and people with him he worked, that the camera that they had, a small camera on the kiosk of the Chernobyl tour, that it was functioning. The Russian soldiers destroyed other cameras on the checkpoints into the zones, but that one was overlooked, and it functioned for more than one day. And he was sitting in Kyiv in his apartment and watching this endless armada of the Russian vehicles and troops passing through the Chernobyl zone. And he later recalled that at some point it looked like that the camera got frozen. In reality, what was happening was that the columns were so long, and it took them a while to get through, and there were also traffic jams to a degree. What he didn't know, and he didn't have at that time ability to realize that, but people in Vienna who were monitoring the situation, the radiation situation in the zone, realized that the level of radiation dramatically went up. And it was not clear why it happened, whether it was already another accident in the making, or eventually it was decided that with the Russians moving heavy equipment and tanks and other things through the zone, trying to get to Kyiv as soon as possible, they raised the radioactive dust. So that one indication of how dangerous the Chernobyl nuclear zone continues to be, and how really reckless the Russian behavior had been, not only when it comes to the people whom they consider to be enemies, or the civil population, but also to their own soldiers, to their own officers, who were sent through the Chernobyl zone, potentially radioactively the most dangerous place on the surface of the earth. And that recklessness, that disregard for human life, for human health, that is one of the key themes also in the entire story of the Russian occupation of Chernobyl.
That is something that really struck me in reading this book, and your account of some of the conversations between the Russians, who of course then showed up at the plant and showed up in front of the kind of foreman of the plant and the Ukrainians who kind of keep the old Chernobyl plant safe. And in those conversations, you talk about the lack of understanding that some of the Russians had about the dangers all around them. And at the same time, some of the officers understood enough to be scared and to know that this was a dangerous place. I thought that was really striking, that they entered this place, but they didn't understand how to be safe within it. Did that surprise you in your research?
It surprised me, and then immediately I found very close parallels with what happened in Chernobyl in 1986. And one of the conclusions that they draw by studying those interviews and materials was that very little changed in the Russian culture in terms of safety, in terms of the treatment of the human life, and value of the human life between the late Soviet times of 1986 and what is happening today. Because the way how the Chernobyl or consequences of the Chernobyl disaster were quote unquote liquidated by liquidators was that the military was sent in, the conscript soldiers. They became the main biorobots, so people who are marching into the most dangerous areas, and with very little protection. The same was here. The Russian soldiers were not informed where they were going. They were surprised, oh, this is that Chernobyl that we heard about. And they had no clue at the end where they ended up, how dangerous it was, because once the Ukrainian armed forces pushed back, Russia lost battle for Kyiv. Occupation of Chernobyl was part of this the first battle of the war for Kyiv. They withdrew, and Ukrainians moved in, and they found out that the Russian soldiers were digging trenches on the edge of the Red Forest. The most dangerous part of the zone. Anyone who watched HBO miniseries Chernobyl knows that. The Russian soldiers didn't know that. They didn't watch HBO miniseries. And but that's just one of the examples of how reckless the behavior had been and how little really changed in Russia since Soviet times.
I want to ask you about the name of the book, Chernobyl Roulette, because that seems to speak to this kind of risk-taking, this gambling, and in a way, those mind games that were going on inside the plant between the Ukrainians and the Russians. So there's a moment that you write about in early March 2022, and so the foreman of the first shift, because the staff did eventually managed to change over, which you also tell that tale. And he meets with the Russian general Sergei Burakov and Colonel Andrei Frolinkov, who are the occupying forces. And at that moment, Putin was sort of threatening the use of nuclear weaponry. And in that moment, the Ukrainians running the plant have quite a bit of leverage, because Valentin Haiko essentially says, I promise you, if Putin uses nuclear weapons, you will slowly and certainly die here together with me. And I have enough knowledge and skill to ensure that you will remain here with us forever. So there's quite a lot of power in the hands of these individuals there to shift the trajectory of the war and move things quite significantly. Was that something that you expected to see?
I didn't. I didn't. That was a discovery and that really turned the story upside down. It was a story in which those who were kidnapped in return kidnapped the kidnappers by using knowledge of the site. And from the very start, from the very beginning, the chief foreman, Haiko, he put himself in the position of power. He said, okay, who are you? I am a representative of Ukraine. You believe that you took over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This is actually a very, very unique site. And you have to follow our rules. Mm-hmm. So at the end of the day, the site was really under the Russian control, but it was Haiko and his staff that were issuing permits for very specific areas for Russians to enter in. So 15 permits were issued altogether. So it wasn't so suddenly the power balance challenged. And this episode from early March is continuation very much of that same story. The Ukrainians were bluffing. The site is still very dangerous, but there is really nothing to explode there. Mm-hmm. Russians didn't know that. And they left the Chernobyl site without really realizing that Ukrainians played them. Later in March, the same month, but later in March, the Russian army attacked the city of Slavutych, which is the city where the stuff came from, where the operators of the newest Chernobyl site live. And once the operators of the site learned about that, they said, okay, we stop any collaboration with you guys. And if you don't stop attacks on our families, on our city, we will find a way to blow this up. Mm-hmm. Again, they were bluffing. There was no way they could do that. Again, there were dangerous places. There was very dangerous and stupid to dig in the Red Forest trenches, but the explosive power per se was not there. Russians didn't know that. And then later, some of them, like Colonel Frolinkov, whom you mentioned, who received the Golden Star of the Hero of Russia for allegedly saving the world from another Chernobyl disaster, when he was the key figure who almost produced it. So he went on Russian TV saying that and believing that the reactors were still operating in Chernobyl when the last operating reactor was shut down in the year 2000. So that also tells you how ill prepared they were to deal with the situation, with the station that they got control of. They were all right in terms of the ways how to take over, how to penetrate through the security barrier on the station. They were trained at the Kursk nuclear power plant that is now in the news, mm-hmm. because it is so close to Chernobyl, mm-hmm. how to get through the security systems. But once there, they had no clue that it was not a normal nuclear power plant anymore. They didn't know what the technological process was there, what the equipment was there, what the protocols were there, and again believed that it was still operating nuclear power plant.
I want to ask you a bit about how the actions of those Ukrainians running the plant were received by other Ukrainians, because actually there wasn't kind of a hot war in that moment, or it obviously wasn't the country, but the Russians didn't fire on the plant, they didn't storm the plant, there wasn't a fight to defend Chernobyl. And that was one decision that was made by the plant operators. And then again, later we've talked about, in relation to the town that they came from, they had quite a lot of power to influence what the Russians were going to do. Were those decisions seen as being in the interests of Ukraine? Are they seen as heroes, or what was the reception, basically, to the actions of the Chernobyl workers?
They found themselves really on many levels in uncharted waters. So that was the first time that war came to the nuclear site, which is a big thing. It really changes now our thinking, or should change our thinking about nuclear power. Because it turned out that nuclear reactors are not protected, and the international agency that is overseeing nuclear energy has no mandate to do anything, or really capacity to do anything about that. But there was also a question where they were cut off from Kyiv, they were cut off from Vienna and headquarters of International Atomic Energy Agency. They had to make decisions on the flight on their own. And one of the biggest decisions was to figure out what is loyalty and what is betrayal under the circumstances. Because the Ukrainian National Guardsmen who protected the plant not from the invading army, but from all sorts of accidents, they decided that it would be irresponsible for them to fight back when the Russian tanks arrived and pointed their guns at the nuclear power plant. So they laid down their weapons. they were taken as prisoners of war. And eventually, when Russians left, they were taken with them as prisoners of war to Russia. Some of them returned to Ukraine as part of the exchange. Others are still in Russia, maybe alive, maybe not. And that was a lesson then when Russians came to another nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, in Zaporizhzhia. There, the Ukrainian National Guardsmen, knowing what happened in Chernobyl, were fighting back. But there was also issue of loyalty and betrayal for the operating staff and for Haiko himself. Working with the Russians, you betray Ukraine, right? Not working, refusing to cooperate, leaving your position, that means endangering the station, endangering Ukraine, endangering the world in general. And eventually they made the decision that under the circumstances their duty, their loyalty, both to Ukraine but also was to the way how they demonstrated it, that they were not leaving the plant. They continued working. And in interviews with Haiko, it was very interesting that he believed that there was one traitor, and that traitor who actually left the station. So they were making these decisions on their own. It's very, very difficult situation. And eventually, the Ukrainian government, once the area was liberated, considered that they were doing the right thing. So they were awarded by President Zelensky the operating staff. The story of the National Guardsmen continues to be a much more unclear story. So none of them, of course, got any awards, even those who came back from Russian captivity. But that whole story once again stresses that we all, humanity as a whole, are in this very unclear, undefined situation. There is no protocols also of what the personnel is supposed to do or not to do under the circumstances, and we really have to take and look very seriously at Chernobyl, at Zaporizhzhia. Now Russians are saying that they are in danger because the Ukrainian troops are a couple of dozen kilometers away from the Kursk nuclear power plant. And it's an irony of the situation because Russians brought war to the nuclear sites. So if we have any hope for nuclear energy to develop and save us from the climate change, we have to learn how to protect the reactors that are already here with us. And in my personal opinion, we have no business of building even one single new reactor until we figure out how to protect the existing ones.
In your view, did Russia target Chernobyl and then Zaporizhzhia sort of intentional strategic goals, or was Chernobyl just in the way of getting to Kyiv?
It was in the way of getting to Kyiv, but eventually they learned how to use it as a weapon also. Because the assumption was correct, that Ukrainians would not attack Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So it became area where the troops that were fighting on the Kyiv front were then retreating, regrouping, had a chance to get some rest and so on and so forth. And later at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Ukrainians are claiming, and there is proof of that they were using the site of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant to fire at the Ukrainian positions on the other side of the Dnieper River, doing that with impunity, because Ukrainians would not attack at least with artillery or with missiles, would not attack the territory of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. With Zaporizhzhia, it was also a huge asset, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. This is a loot also, the spoils of war that Russians, of course, are trying to get in any way they can when it comes to the state. they're still in nuclear power plants. When it comes to individuals, the story of the occupation of Chernobyl was really looting everything that they could get their hands on. The equipment, the computers, laptops, everything, including in the city of Chernobyl. There is a lot of witnesses, testimonies. I write about that. So it also was quite shocking. Not motivated army, not informed about where they are being sent, but also army in which it is absolutely okay. It is expected that the soldiers reward themselves by looting the not just nuclear power plant, but population and taking away whatever they want to take. Yeah. It's a Middle Ages story, really, in that sense.
You describe in the book, in some points fairly critically, the reaction of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And you just mentioned the need to kind of draw up better rules, better understanding about how operators can act in situations of war. Is that the body that should step up and kind of enact, create a clearer system, a clearer process, and maybe have some teeth to enforce any rules that they create? Or do we need another body to kind of protect the world from, when war comes to a nuclear site?
Yes, they came up with the 5 principles that they recommend to the countries at war to keep in mind. And just today I checked the news. Yesterday, Rafael Grossi, the Director General of IAEA, visited the Kursk nuclear power plant. He again referred to those 5 principles, but it's more like a public relations PR action. He also visited Chernobyl after liberation and Zaporizhia nuclear power plant still under the Russian occupation. The issue is not Grossi, because personally he showed also the courage as a human being doing that. But he or his institution actually has no mandate to do anything about that. They were created in the late 50s as really a lobbying body for the nuclear energy. Their mandate is discourage people to develop nuclear weapons and encourage people to develop nuclear energy. So they come with recommendations. But what Ukrainians wanted from them, and Russians complained but didn't ask for that for Kursk, the Ukrainians wanted actually IAEA and the international community to declare the nuclear sites to be no war zones. So areas that the armies would not enter, that the battles would not take place there. The IAEA ignored that because they have no capacity to introduce that. The Russians never asked about that, but raised a lot of fuss about Ukrainians getting closer to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So we clearly need the institution that is not conflicted in terms of its mission. We also have the body of international agreements that would support a much more decisive actions on the part of international community toward Chernobyl, toward nuclear sites, and we have to do that as soon as possible. The fact that Russians are now complaining and calling for IAEA to intervene and say that, okay, they're useless, this is exactly the language that was used by Ukrainians before that. And what that says is that actually it's in the interest now of all sides to have an international body, to have a body of laws that would protect those sites. So I'm a little bit more hopeful, but not too hopeful.
Just one final thought. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster, which you also refer to as sort of Chernobyl 1, changed the way that the world sees nuclear power, nuclear energy, and lives on in all of our minds. Do you think that Chernobyl 2 so that occupation and how close, Ukrainians in the world came to another nuclear disaster has changed thinking further?
I don't see this happening at this point, and one of the reasons is the way how we as a society really react to certain things. If it was a disaster itself of the proportions of Chernobyl, okay, it's difficult to ignore it. You have to do something about that. But if Chernobyl 2 didn't happen, it was close to that, but it didn't happen. Nothing exploded, thank God, yet at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, or Ukraine didn't attack Kursk nuclear power plant. Okay, it's not an issue, right? So somehow, people like Heiko or Rafael Grossi or whoever it is saved us from that. So it's not an issue. It's not urgent. And this is really what is happening here. People are much more concerned about the use of the nuclear weapons, which in my personal opinion is, it's not like the threat doesn't exist, but it's absolutely minimal. We live in the world where there is an international consensus, there is a taboo on the use of nuclear weapons, which for Putin to use nuclear weapons would mean also complicated enormously relations, not just with the West, but also with its backers, the Russia's backers like China or India for that matter. But it's much easier to either create conditions for an accident or really to weaponize this nuclear sites, and because there is no way to figure out who really caused the accident, who caused the disaster. In Ukraine, the Kakhovka Dam was blown up, and till today, Russians are pointing at Ukrainians at Russians. International community says we don't know what happened. And so you can really turn the nuclear power site into the dirty bomb and avoid responsibility to a degree that it's impossible to do with the use of nuclear weapons till now. So in my opinion, when we talk about things nuclear, the real threat, nuclear threat, comes from this continuing control of Russia of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's much more real threat than the use of nuclear weapons. But again, I not that I don't think, I know for sure that this is not how majority of people think or feel about things nuclear and this current war. In a matter of speaking, the war in Ukraine went nuclear already on the very first day with the occupation of the Chernobyl nuclear site.
That's a really interesting thought, and thank you so much for telling us a bit about the thinking behind your book, Chernobyl Roulette, which, as well as obviously talking about what is a dark story. I mean, there are so many fascinating details in there and some real stories of personal bravery that I think people won't have heard before. So I think it's a really fascinating read, and thank you for coming to talk to us about it.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.